I'm your host, Salvatore Babones, and joining me today is the Right Reverend Robert Forsyth, formerly the Anglican Bishop of South Sydney and currently a Senior Fellow at the Center for Independent Studies. Rob and I will be discussing his new book, Forgotten Freedom No More, Protecting Religious Liberty in Australia. Rob Forsyth, how are you?
Great to be in. Great to join you, Salvatore.
Great, you look
Can you
very
see
comfortable
me?
there.
Here I am. I'm very comfortable. I'm sitting here on my balcony on a sunny day in the eastern suburb of Sydney.
Well, I'm glad you still have the freedom to do that. Let's talk today about freedom of religion. Look, you call it a
Yeah.
forgotten freedom. Is it a forgotten right? What's the state of play for religious liberty in Australia today?
Okay. Let me make 3 points.
All right.
Religious liberty is valuable, varied, and vulnerable. It's a valued mark of a mature liberal society that people are able to conduct their lives according to their own religions. And secondly, it's varied because religious freedom is not just about believing things, it's about also behaving in certain ways, following on those beliefs. It's about being able to gather together in communities and institutions and teach what. And it's varied. There are different kinds of religions and different shapes it takes. But this is the key point. It's vulnerable because it's not a right in Australia. It's merely a freedom. And a freedom means simply that no one's taken it away yet. Freedom is like an empty patch of ground, not yet impinged upon.
Now, you say not
book,
yet, which seems to imply...
Yeah, because well, that's right. See, when we say forgotten freedom no more, what we meant was not there was no freedom, but no one cared much about it because it was just taken for granted. But we think there are issues today in which the issue is no longer forgotten. It's become more contentious and therefore worthy of further thought and reflection.
Right. So what's the state of play? I mean, you say it's no longer being forgotten, but is it threatened? I mean, what's going on here?
Well, firstly, compared to places like North Korea, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Australia is a paradise for religious freedom. So we must keep this whole debate in perspective.
Well, you're setting a low bar here, Rob.
No, but that's very important because for lovers of liberty in the world, their minds mustn't be just about themselves, but aware of the major gross infringements on human rights and religious freedom occurring, serious persecution that's occurring around the world. In Australia, it's fairly benign with this slight problem. Australia has undergone massive social changes in the last decades, and therefore religious communities now find themselves often in a situation of holding minority views on what are now regarded as important social questions or moral questions, like particularly it's often focused on sexuality questions. Secondly, we've had a growth of law in this country importantly protecting against discrimination, and those laws have grown and grown and grown. And therefore we have a situation where, although religion is still free, it is facing severe, that patch I mentioned, unconstrained, it's facing the threat, particularly of finding its practices running into the face of these non-discrimination laws, and therefore finding itself restricted. And this particularly came to a head after the equal marriage matter at the end of 2017. Seems a long time ago, doesn't it?
Right.
And that's where the issue came to a head.
Right.
And that's what's led to the present government having a proposed bill, and we decided to write this book to bring perspectives and analysis to some important areas in the question.
Right. Now, the bill has gone through a few iterations. I actually was going to read the current draft religious discrimination bill before our interview, except I found it was 58 pages of legalese, and I gave up on it. Could you, what's going on with this bill came out of the Ruddock Review. Could you explain to everyone what the Ruddock Review was, just briefly, so people know? But then let's talk about the bill.
And then, when there was expressed concern by some people that if the law regarding marriage was changed so for equal marriage or same-sex marriage, it might put those who do not believe that is in fact what marriage should be like in an invidious political situation, churches, mosques, synagogues, and others who hold a different view. Would they be still free to hold and practice their view? And the government at the time offered what governments often do, Salvatore, an inquiry. Yes, and this inquiry was meant to, and they got Philip Ruddock to do the inquiry, and other very eminent people. And it reported on the whole that not much was wrong, which wasn't that hard to believe, because since the law was only changed and the inquiry met just soon afterwards, but it didn't make certain proposals, which I won't bother going into detail. The government decided that it would respond by passing a federal anti-discrimination, anti-religious discrimination law. And that's now in the second stage. Although it's 58 pages, Salvatore, it's very simple at one level. It makes religion a protected attribute. A federal law, Commonwealth law, says you cannot discriminate against somebody for religion. Secondly, it defines discrimination in two ways: direct discrimination, where I don't like your religion, so I don't give you a job for that reason.
Right.
But more interestingly, Salvatore, indirect, and that's when a company or a government make a decision which on the whole is lawful, but has the impact of a worse impact on people of certain religious views. For example, if you're a law firm and say, I want you all to work on a Friday night, and I'm an Orthodox Jew, which is Shabbat, and you don't make other provisions, you're indirectly discriminating. Or you tell me you're a hospital, I want you to participate in these terminations. I'm a devout Catholic or Anglican. I say, no, this is wrong. If you don't make provision, you're indirectly discriminating. And thirdly, the bill says it's not discriminatory if a person if a person engages in good faith into conduct which is since flowing out of the doctrines of that religion or teaching of that religion. In other words, you can teach what your religion teaches and do what it does. So if I'm an Anglican, I'm selecting people for my hospital or my school. It's not a discrimination for me to say, I would like you to be an Anglican, or I wouldn't like you to be. So that's the three things.
So you're going from
really just about this. It's not about a right to religion. It's merely about a freedom from discrimination. So it's not a religious right bill. It's a religious discrimination bill.
So
and
you're really going
it's
from
the thing that's been most contentious.
Yeah.
So
You're really going from
most contentious has been the most contentious has been the question of this right to teach and make statements from your faith. This has caused great anxiety from some of the people that you'll come to later.
Right, so you're really coming from the least contentious to the most contentious, because I don't think anyone would object to people having the freedom to worship as they want. Some people might object to that second indirect discrimination. For example, some people might think that if you're religiously anti-abortion, you shouldn't be required to refer people for abortions, or if you're opposed to gender therapies, you shouldn't be required to refer people. So let's focus on that as the sort of controversial part. And then we'll get to the hugely controversial part after. I mean, do you think that's right, that people that organizations should, carve out exceptions? I mean, if you're a psychologist working for a psychology group and someone comes in for a referral, don't you have to refer people to all legally acceptable services, not just ones you approve of?
It's not about approving of. It's about the person having conscientious, deeply held belief that a certain course of action is not just undesirable but deeply wrong.
Right.
And if you want to empty our hospitals of all Catholic doctors by forcing all doctors to take part in terminations, go ahead. But I strike me this is a deeply illiberal thing to do when you can make provisions. It's a question of making provisions. The fundamental fact of our society is we are a pluralist society. We have different views. We don't agree. And how can we live freely, as most freely as we can, in a world where we don't all agree, and we won't all agree. But we're never going to one day say, yes, everyone thinks the same. That's the issue.
So under this bill, if I object to performing a medical procedure or giving medical advice, it's not that the person wouldn't get the advice. It's that I would simply refer the patient to somebody else. That is, I wouldn't participate.
I mean, it depends on the arrangement. But
the employer would make an arrangement.
Indirect discrimination would be where the employer is not. If they can't make the arrangement, that's different. But if you can make the arrangement, and I've got an arrangement in place that effectively excludes you from working because you're a Jew on the Shabbat, or you hold deep views about end of life or beginning of life issues, if I make provision, I'm not corrected. The most contentious, though, wasn't that. The most contentious was the bit about being able to speak, make statements of belief. If I give a statement of belief, my religion, that in and of itself is not discrimination. The key phrase is, if I am vilifying people, if I'm harassing them, that's not protected. But in and of itself, these statements are not discrimination, even if you find them wrong and offensive.
Right. Let me dial it back, though, to that second, because I still want to work through this idea. Now, I know neither of us are lawyers. At least I assume you're not a lawyer as well as a priest.
I'm only a bush lawyer, I'm afraid.
But let me push you a little more on this, because in Victoria, for example, assisted suicide is legal. Psychologists or psychiatrists, I'm not sure how it's handled, make referrals for assisted suicide. If because of your religious beliefs, you vehemently disagree with assisted suicide, does that mean that you will never have the chance to give advice to elderly people who might be considering it, because your employer will simply assign you to some other duty because you won't give the right advice?
That could happen. And normally, if you're a doctor in private practice, you would advise them not to. And I, by the way, I don't think we should just be on religious grounds. I think on some of those matters, we may be opposed to assisting someone killing themselves on other grounds as an atheist. And I think you also should be protected. Where there are these edge issues, which there's not deep moral consensus, we as a society ought to allow people not to have to violate their conscience to get a job in those positions. It's just, it's obvious to me, but not to others. And if you think it's important that people are able to get help to kill themselves or so forth, then the government will make other arrangements.
Right. So let's talk about the biggie. The third provision you talked about was the ability to hire who you want for your school, your hospital, So how does that play out?
It's more complicated than this.
Okay.
Most discrimination law protects religious freedom by having carve-outs, by saying that nothing in this bill applies to certain conditions of religious. I've got it here. It's rather complicated, but something like nothing in this bill. This is the Anti-Discrimination Act in New South Wales, as an example. Nothing in this act affects the ordination of priests, the training of the clergy, the appointment of people established to propagate religion, or any other practice which is, quote, which would necessarily avoid injury to the religious susceptibilities. So the law that says you can't discriminate on the basis of someone's gender or sex doesn't apply to the Roman Catholic Church, because they have male priesthood, and therefore the normal rule is, in normal life you can't reject someone for the job of being a shop assistant because they're a man or a woman. There are certain places where the Catholic Church and various Jewish organisations, so they're carve-outs, right?
Okay.
And now that whole question of carve-outs, especially to do with who is employed at schools, caused a great excitement during the Wentworth by-election here in New South Wales in when was it? I'm trying to think, it was 2018. Great, everyone went berserk, and the government, they preferred these whole carve-outs because the Rotary report had proposed minor changes to the present law. Okay. People suddenly got very excited it was the law, and so the federal government referred to the Australian Law Reform Commission. They're still looking into it. So that's there. The Anti-Discrimination Act that is present here merely says that discriminating on the basis of someone's religion is allowed. In other words, you can't protect religion and then say all you Jews have to hire Christians, or all you Muslims have to hire Buddhists. You've got to allow each community to select people to keep the integrity of their community. That's what we're saying. That's why it's not discrimination, it's selection. And that's the most controversial wasn't that, it was the fact that a statement of faith in of itself is not discrimination. And some people have said this means that Christians will be going around abusing people and causing all these, saying these terrible things, homophobic, bigoted remarks. This has been the fear. It's not the case because at present there's no law stopping that anyway, except in Tasmania. Right. And it merely says that for a Christian or a Buddhist or a Jew or a Sikh to make a statement according to their faith should not be contrary to law in this country. And I think that as long as it's done in good faith, not to vilify others, it's perfectly normal. I don't see what the problem is.
So as an American, and of course, we Americans are very attached to our freedom of speech. As an American, I was a bit surprised coming to Australia with all the, defamation and hate speech and all these laws limiting speech. And something I found very troubling was during the gay marriage referendum, I heard people suggesting that opposing the referendum, that is advocating that people should vote no, was a form of hate speech. Well, how can you have a referendum if voting one way constitutes, your act of voting is an act of hate?
It wasn't a referendum, it was an indicative plebiscite, but just park that question.
Right, okay,
I think this reflects the sad place we are in this country. One of the great problems this debate is bedeviled by is deep mistrust on both sides, and that many people who are were for the change of the meaning of marriage regarded those who were opposed as having bad faith, that they were really not conscientiously objecting, but it was basically a deep form of prejudice and anti-gay hatred, and therefore that all the talk about religious freedom was a smokescreen. On the other hand, those in religious communities were thinking that many of the call for the proper recognition that marriage gave to homosexual other people was really a way of, was also deeply a matter of bad faith. No one's been really listening sympathetic to each other in this country, and that's still the case today. And so we have even this poor bill that's really, I think, on the whole, fairly non-contentious. It's a bit complicated. The lack of bad faith means that you will get the situation where someone will say, if you advocate a vote no, you are being a bigot or something like that. I blame you Americans, actually, because a lot of people are reading this debate through the lens of the civil rights debates in the US in the 70s and 60s. And so those of us like myself who don't think that the law of marriage should have been changed are often painted as equivalent to those defending Jim Crow laws in the South. And when you think we're like that, then there's no space for us. We are regarded as morally reprehensible. We want to say, no, we have good faith. You may not agree with us. We understand that. The reasons we disagree are very deep. And what we're asking for is what we want to give respect and freedom and receive respect and freedom.
Okay.
That's the only way to proceed.
Now, we're about to go to questions. So those of you listening, if you can get your questions in the chat box in YouTube, that's the best place for them. If you post questions elsewhere, like on Facebook, they'll get back to me. But if you're watching on YouTube, straight in the chat box on YouTube. I'd also like to take this opportunity to encourage everyone to subscribe if you're not already subscribed to the CIS YouTube channel. Obviously, like the video, that helps us. But crucially, this is end of financial year. CIS, like many other organizations, is out here asking for your support. But there is a big difference. The CIS does not accept any government funding of any kind whatsoever. And that even includes completely non-political government funding like JobKeeper. So CIS, while other organizations have been able to access JobKeeper benefits in order to keep people employed and to keep their payroll going, the Center for Independent Studies has forgone that. So CIS particularly needs your contribution because the CIS is absolutely not depending on government largesse to get through this crisis. It's relying on you and your generosity. So please, there's a link there in the comment section on YouTube, or just go to the CIS website. You can, if you're not already a member, become a member. Membership tiers start at $40 a year, which is pretty mild. In fact, if you were coming to this as a live event, you'd probably be paying $40 for the event. So we'd really appreciate you getting a membership at CIS, or if you're already a member, donating as part of the end of financial year campaign. We are going to take some questions. I have one more question for you, Rob, and I see you're about to hold it up. I want to ask you about
I want
the
to talk
book.
about this, yeah.
So I have my copy of the book right here.
Well, I've got mine is similar. It's Concord published it. It's available online, and the real physical copy is coming out shortly. What we tried to do was to get together a very broad group of people who are sympathetic to the cause of religious freedom in Australia and are concerned about its vulnerability from all kinds of backgrounds. So we deliberately got atheists. This sounds like a joke. An atheist, an Anglican, Roman Catholic, Jew, Muslim. We got historians, probably too many lawyers. I'm afraid that's the danger of this area. And so, and there's, I think, some very important chapters indeed, different perspectives, and in a very CIS way. Though we agree there is an issue here, and it should be a concern for all lovers of liberty, whether you're religious or not, so that we do have a robust religious freedom in this country protected. The ways forward disagree. Some say that the law is always making things worse, so we can't rely upon the law to save us. Others are proposing a Religious Freedom Act, a positive freedom, which and some are going forward in matters a bit like the way the government suggested. So it's a very interesting, wide-ranging read. So I do, if I say so myself, recommend it.
Well, and I see you've got some big names in there. Henry Ergus.
Yes.
We've got James Allen, Augusto Zimmerman, not least Peter Curti is in the book.
Patrick Parkinson, Rabbi Elton from the Great Synagogue, Michael Bird from Ridley College in Melbourne, Tanvir and Med, the psychiatrist, the Muslim background and so forth. And I've written, with help from Peter and others, a lengthy introduction to, not just a brief one, but a kind of a case for religious freedom and trying to lay the issue out in many words. So it's in two parts: analysis of the problems and issues, and then perspectives. And we're hoping that we're a bit anxious actually that the law might get changed and the whole issue not be an issue. But the way things are going, we may never have any change in law. This may be a perennial question, so the book may never lose its currency.
All right. Well, the purchase link is down there in the comment section. Edward has a question for you. Do you think that Christian schools should be allowed to fire teachers who they discover are homosexual or who have changed their sexuality since their appointment?
Should they have the legal right to? I think they should. Should they do it? That is, it's a difficult question, this one, and this is the one of the real hot issues. How to put this? For school, most Christian schools, and I'm on the board of an Anglican school, are very generous in these areas and are not hardline, and that's not the case. There are some schools which I call intensive religious communities, where the teachers, the staff are all expected to be fully on board with an intent, a deliberate Christian or Jewish or Muslim view of the world, in their education. I think in those circumstances, if a teacher says, not that they are homosexual, I don't think that should be. It's more about behaviour. I intend to live a way of life in my sexual life. It turns out to be contrary to that of whatever the religious mores of the institution is or the community. I think if the community might say, look, we want people who walk the walk in their personal lives, as we teach here. So I suspect they should have the freedom to do that, to protect their the integrity of their community.
And to be clear,
it can't be free from the moral laws which say you can't do that. This is the question that the Australian Law Reform Commission will come back with sometime after the when.
And although so much of the talk about this is about homosexuality, this would equally apply, I suppose, to unmarried couples.
It could. It could refer to any behaviour which is in tension or contrary to the expected behaviour of adherents of the religion who intend to make their school an exemplar of that religion. In the modern world, in the modern world, the biggest difference is over sexuality. It's the biggest changes occurred in the last 50 years, where religious communities are now minorities. I call them recalcitrant minorities. The whole view is that were once mainstream, but are now regarded as weird in many cases, and immoral. Are they going to be able to keep those communities in those terms, or will the state say, no, you must sign up to this view of sexuality? And I say they shouldn't, even if they're wrong. I'm just not arguing that the schools are right. My case is not who's right about sexuality, it's the freedom to maintain the integrity of your community.
Right. Anthony wants to know about the rights of parents. Should parents have rights to, over what their children are learning in school?
Of course, in general terms, yes, because schooling, parents are the primary response. The right of a parent to a child is a natural right that no one can take away. That's a given right. And the state says, in fact, the state says if you can do it, you can train your kids at home. I've got friends who are doing homeschooling. I was glad to get them out, frankly, in someone else's hands. But the parents have the primary responsibility for the upbringing of their children. I think the community rightly says there are certain standards of what should be taught, aware that individual parents can't educate a child without help, and therefore there's a place for schooling. What I don't want to see is schools saying they know better than parents on some of these contentious moral issues. That would be wrong.
Right. Now, Gay wants to, though, make a distinction between what employees do in their personal lives versus what employees do in their professional lives. I mean, is it reasonable? Well, you said that religious organizations may demand that their employees not only talk the talk but walk the walk in their personal lives. Yeah. Is that a reasonable requirement?
Firstly, Gay's right. There's a big distinction between the two, and there is a distinction, absolutely. The question is, how watertight is that distinction? Normally, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant in my view. I know nothing about you, Salvatore, but for your work in the CIS, what matters is your work in the CIS. Where you have situations where people are acting as moral exemplars, as mentors, then that distinction, though still real, is not as watertight. And so if someone in their private life, I'll give you an example. If I was in a women's refuge, but really was abusive and was a very good work in the refuge, but at home I was dishonouring to my wife, you think, hang on, Rob, there's something wrong here. You can't be saying one thing at work. That's only true of certain jobs, not many, but it can apply in religious communities, particularly the ones I call intensive religious communities and their schools.
Well, I guess the big controversy here is over teachers in school, and especially because religious schools in Australia often receive funding from the government.
Yeah.
Let's get to that example. I mean, should a teacher in a publicly funded religious school be free to do whatever she, he, or Z wants in Z's spare time?
It depends. In principle, it depends upon why the government is funding the school. If the government is funding schools or funding an institution, let's make it wider than schools, shall we? Because this might apply to other places. The government says, I'm going to fund you because the government needs someone to act on behalf of the government. We're tendering out this maybe our employment service. The government's got a perfect right to say, here are the terms. If you want the jobs, you want to get the tender, here are the terms. But if the government is funding organisations because they want to encourage diversity and they want to encourage different kinds of schools, then you must make sure that if you want religious schools, you've got to make sure they have the freedom to maintain their religion. Otherwise, there's no point. So,
well,
if
in
they
Australia,
have the freedom to order select their staff by their criteria, you eventually are creating an existential threat to the very irreligious nature of the school. And therefore, if that's why the government's funding them, they shouldn't be imposing upon the schools certain employment requirements.
Well, in Australia, is the government funding schools as a service provider? Because practically speaking, schools religious institutions have historically provided these services, and the government picks up the tab, or is the government funding religious schools, as you say, in order to promote diversity in education? I mean, to my mind, there doesn't seem to be a lot of diversity in education in Australia. It seems like there's a very heavy-handed curriculum coming down from above.
You may be right. In the 1880s, almost all the states, the government established its own schooling system, and there was no money provided for religious schools. But some churches, the Roman Catholic Church, with great sacrifice, without a cent from the government, maintained their systems, often using religious, that is, dedicated celibate nuns and so forth. In the 1950s, I think it was in Australia, the crucial matter, the federal government decided to make some money available to help some of these schools continue. And since then, the trickle has become much more of a flood, and in fact more of a flood under John Howard, even more. I think it's for diversity. It's to say we want to have a strong, vibrant government system. We also want to allow an independent system, not just high fees, not just the rich schools, but particularly independent system which are providing an alternative, low fee schools, and that's what's happening. So I think it is because of diversity, and therefore the government should allow the bodies running these schools to maintain the selection criteria, to maintain their integrity, rather than being washed out to become a mere, so they can no longer keep who they are.
All right. Now, Edward asks a question about a story.
Right.
Yeah, Edward asks just a question about a story in The Economist. They gave an example of a nurse who was frightening patients before they went in for operations by talking about heaven and preparing their souls and getting ready just in case. And she was fired by the hospital for, frightening patients.
Yeah.
Now that's not, she wasn't frightened for being religious. She was frightened. She was fired for expressing her very genuine concerns there in the workplace. How do you view these kind of borderline cases?
Well, firstly, it is borderline, isn't it? She's there to be a nurse. She's not the chaplain. She's there to be a nurse. I understand from her point of view why this is regarded as very helpful. But I think in that situation, if she's frightening, and the way she's doing it also may be quite unhelpful, she may not be skilled to do it. I think that she should be doing nursing, caring, quietly praying if she's a religious person. But there I suspect the hospital had a point to say, look, don't do this to your patients. Find other ways, but not this. So that's what I think probably the hospital had a right to do it. I think I may be wrong, but that's one of the. There are a whole lot of areas, Salvatore, which I like that on the edge.
Right.
On the edge, and that's what we need to acknowledge. That the debate needs acknowledgement of its complexity and its nuance, rather than the kind of black and whiteness, which I think increasingly has bedeviled the debate in Australia, certainly. Where some want to push back entirely so that religion should just be something kept inside the mosque or the church or the synagogue and have really nothing to do with public life. And others are saying, no, that's not right. We need to be able to exist and breathe and play our part in serving this society.
All right. Now, I need to make a quick plug. A week from Friday, the Center for Independent Studies will be hosting George Will. Now, if you don't know George Will, he is a big-time American political columnist. In fact, I used to subscribe to Newsweek. This will tell you how nerdy I always have been. I used to subscribe to Newsweek in high school, and George Will was writing the back page column in Newsweek back in the 1980s when I was in high school, and he's been a columnist ever since. He was already big in the 1980s. Now, he's going to be doing a CIS event. He was supposed to be giving a lecture here in person. He won't be able to do that. He's doing an event a week from Friday that is on Friday, June 5th. You can register for that. The link is in the comments section. We'd love to have you join us for the George Will lecture. Rob, we have a comment from Anthony, but I think you might want to respond to it. If the government funds a school, it should expect the school to teach non-religious subjects. So what about the STEM subjects?
Yes.
And should there be a standard for how they teach biology, I guess, is probably the big contentious one.
Simple answer, yes, and yes. a religious school is not a school that teaches just religion. A religious school teaches what needs to be taught in the context of a religious community and outlook. So yes, all those things, perfectly right for the government to say, you teach, this is the curriculum. In fact, this is what we regard as education. This is and the perfect right to insist on that if they're to be educated.
Right. Now, Max, our producer, our executive producer, I've got to take this question. The orders come down from above. There's more than one.
The answer is whatever it is, he's right. Is that the answer?
there's more than one above in this live stream. Look, he wants to know, how is the pandemic impacting attendance at services, especially Eid is right now. Of course, we had Easter just passed. What's been the effect, and will it be long term?
I can only speak my own experience as a Christian minister, because I'm still working part time as well as for CAS. I'm still in ministry part time. We've gone online, and we've learned very, very quickly the art of doing things online, producing services. I run Bible studies online, even have morning tea on Zoom. It seems on the whole that it's been remarkably successful in maintaining connection of communities. It's really hard when you can't meet together physically, because believers often come together for meals and for the sacraments in my tradition. I've heard of one church in Sydney. This is true, I heard just yesterday. I'll mention it. It's Christ Church St Lawrence there in Railway Square, a very lively Anglo-Catholic Anglican church. Right. Someone told me that they're getting 11,000 hits on their stream service.
Wow.
Many from overseas. I've also heard other places where when churches have been streaming their services, many of their neighbours who didn't have the courage to turn up, and just sometimes sticking their nose in and watching what's going on. So it's not been the death of religion. It seems to be, as it often does, adapting. Although, to be frank with you, as a time of broadcasting on today, I'm surprised that it may be changed after this broadcast has been gone on. But here in New South Wales, we can have pubs and clubs with up to 50, but churches can't. So I've been suggesting that maybe we should start selling booze in the churches so we can lift up. This is an anomaly that could be changed.
Well, I have one final question for you, and we are about to wrap up, so we'll be leaving it here for viewer questions. But I do have one final question for you, Rob, and that's about the long-term effect of churches learning how to go online. Now, of course, we've had online for 30 years, but these services that are going online, are these going to continue post-coronavirus? Are these services, and I mean that in both senses, both religious services, but also these services to the communities that churches provide, are they going to be now in the internet age in a way they never were before?
I bet. Some.
Right.
I think we've learned two things, and I think we've learned it in all areas of life. We've learned, we can do much more online than we thought. Right. And isn't that great? And so the church I'm at, we think when we get back together in the same rebuilding, which we're longing to do, it's not the same experience at all. We may still live stream for those who can't. So I think I appreciate being together, drinking the bread and eating the bread, drinking the wine, the sacrament, hearing, being together, around together. That matters a great deal. But also we've realised that you can do a lot more online than you thought. And so we're not going to go back to never online. And many, I don't know about other traditions, but many clergy in my tradition have suddenly become rather expert online producers. And skilled. So we're stepping up and learning about it. It's a fascinating thing to watch, actually.
Well, Reverend Robert Forsyth, thank you for joining me today on Liberty. Please, everyone, have a look for the book. It's at Connor Court Publishing. Rob, we really appreciate you being on the show. I'd also like to thank everyone for watching, of course. I'd like to thank our producer, Emily Holmes, who's kept everything running on a shoestring budget. Emily, thank you for keeping us on the air. Our executive producer, Max Hawk Weaver, and the director of CIS is Tom Switzer. Thanks, everyone, and we will see you, or at least you will see us, next week.